Hello YouTube, another boring video from the whole soul and a bit of a hangover as well. Anyways, in part 1 he argued that Muhammad was a paedophile because he had sex with a child, and that by definition is paedophilia. Sounds like a no-brainer to me, but there you go. In this video we're going to talk about the morality of the custom whereby children are allowed to marry old men. So first of all, marrying children at the age of 9 to serve as domestic housewives, sexual concubines and baby makers denies them the opportunity to obtain an education and perhaps even a career. Given the fact I haven't heard of any boys being married off to women as old as their grandmothers, I am forced to conclude that this custom treats women unfairly and unequally because it denies them an opportunity that is available to their male counterparts. Now, although Muslims claim to believe in the moral equality between males and females, they seem to ignore this issue in relation to the custom in question. Now, the next argument is from autonomy. Basically, to act autonomously means being able to think freely and independently for oneself, to be able to critically evaluate the situation in order to determine whether or not it is in one's best interest. Now, arranged marriages by their very nature mean that the parents are going to be involved in the decision-making process, so it cannot be said that the bride-to-be is thinking independently. Now, I'm not saying all arranged marriages are coercive, but it would be extremely naive to say that none are. And given the fact that these girls can be as young as 9 when they're allowed to enter marriage, only enhances their susceptibility to coercion, manipulation and deception, all of which would count as violations of one's autonomy. Now, in order to critically evaluate a situation, it is essential to have the capacity to do so. This may require some form of education, and when that is not available, at the very least it requires that one has developed cognitive faculties. But according to science, we know that only after the age of 11 is the cognitive faculties in human beings developed. So it cannot be said that a girl at the age of 9 can critically evaluate her situation as would an adult. Now, although Muslims claim to respect autonomy, at the same time they also defend this custom. So in my mind, they obviously do not understand the meaning to act autonomously. If, however, they are going to make the argument that arranged marriages do respect autonomy, they need to A, argue that they are never coercive, and B, that a child at the age of 9 has got the capacity to think critically, both of which I believe are untrue. Now, the third argument is from welfare. Simply put, marrying children off to old men is not in the best interest in terms of well-being. It's psychologically harmful. You're depriving these children of their childhood, their innocence, and placing them in an adult situation that they're not emotionally prepared to deal with. Furthermore, you're separating these children from their parents, placing them in a relationship with some old dirtbag they have absolutely nothing in common with. Now, on top of this, throw in a few miscarriages and a few babies later. Some studies have shown that females at the ripe old age of 14 suffer from severe mental depression. Now, there's physical harm that can't be ignored either. Girls at the age of 9 are not sexually or physically mature. Therefore, sexual intercourse with an adult male over a prolonged period of time may result in permanent damage to their sexual organs and skeletal structure. Comparative studies have shown that compared with women over the age of 18, teenage pregnancies and pre-teenage pregnancies are more problematic, so you're going to have more miscarriages. Furthermore, when after the child is born, there's a higher rate of infant mortality with teenage and pre-teenage pregnancies. Now, if you don't believe me about this, there's a whole litany of other problems involved with young pregnancies. If you don't believe me, ask a Muslim doctor if he would recommend that a child of 9 marry an adult. Now, what Muslims like to hold up is Aisha as this gleaming example of paedophilia. They say because she said nothing harmful or negative about Muhammad, therefore she was not psychologically harmed. However, I agree with conservative atheists on this. Maybe she's afraid of getting her head chopped off by the supporters of Muhammad. But I think a more powerful argument would say that because she thought Muhammad was the prophet, she's not going to say anything negative about the prophet, not in fear of retribution from Muhammad's followers, but in fear of retribution from God in the afterlife. But let us assume, for argument's sake, that Aisha did have a splendid and a rosy experience. Not all girls are as fortunate to have married a celebrity like Muhammad. Now, if Muslims are, however, going to invoke this argument of Aisha, I want them to know it's the weakest possible argument. Why? Because it's like saying, you know, one man who had a car accident but he didn't receive any psychological or physical trauma, therefore everybody who has a car accident doesn't receive any psychological or physical trauma. So it's an extremely weak argument. Now, Muslims are blue in the face, I think, explaining or arguing why it is not wrong for children to marry old men. You know, It's perfectly normal, it's perfectly fine, yet none of them would have their own daughters in the same situation. So I want to challenge Muslims out there. I want to challenge Muslims to produce a moral argument as to why this custom of marrying children is morally good and in the best interest of the girls involved, and maybe support this argument with some psychological or medical studies. Now, it's kind of laughable in my view that Muslims, although they claim to have the word of God and a monopoly over morality, all of a sudden they retreat to a cultural argument in defense of the relationship between Muhammad and Aisha. I want Muslims to know that just to say it is part of my culture is not a justification in itself, much less an excuse for the continuation of an immoral practice. Imagine you're trying to explain the immorality to an Aztec about sacrificing an innocent human being, and he explains, well, it's part of my culture. You see, the moment you invoke the cultural argument, you're no longer participating in a moral dialogue. Instead, you're adopting a position of an anthropologist or something. Now, in order to justify a custom or a culture, you need to have good reasons to do so. So one reason floated about by Muslims is that because girls have their first menses, they are therefore reproductively mature. Once they're reproductively mature, they are therefore adults and therefore eligible for marriage. But according to science, the majority of females are not reproductively mature when they reach their first menses. This may take months or even years after. So the very criteria or reason Muslims use to defend this practice does not apply to the majority of females. But let us just say, for argument's sake, that all women do reach reproductive maturity when they have their first menses. Does this justify the practice? No, it doesn't, because it doesn't take the welfare of children who have the condition known as precocious or early puberty. So you can have puberty at 8, 9, 10 or 11. They're not protected in terms of welfare. So it is morally superior to have an age of consent at the bare minimum at 12. Now, it's also arbitrary, in my view, to link adulthood to reproductive maturity, because there are other criteria out there, such as mental maturity and physical maturity, or both. Plus, the fact the criteria Muslims use is inapplicable to the majority of females. Now, another reason floated about by Muslims is that because it was a cultural norm and no one objected to the marriage between Muhammad and Aisha, it was therefore perfectly fine and normal. But since when is morality based on consensus or popular opinion? It only took one man, Mohammed, to point out the immorality of infanticide, despite the fact that it was a cultural norm and no one objected to the practice at that time. Yes, in my culture, everyone does object to the custom whereby children marry old men, but this doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have damn good reason to object. And this is the whole idea of the debate here, is that you have to give me your reasons why it's a good thing, and we go back and forth. Now, I suppose in closing, did Muhammad act immorally? Yes, I believe Muhammad did act immorally, because the custom of marrying children is an immoral practice. Now, I'm not going to assign guilt to the people of Muhammad's time, however, because they didn't know any better. So there's an empirical issue to be considered. For example, if you have a doctor and he's administering medicine to a patient, but he's unaware that this medicine is harmful to the patient, we cannot really say that he is acting guilty, because he actually believes that he's helping and not hurting the patient, and he's unaware of the damage being done. But this empirical issue doesn't apply to Muhammad, because he should have known better, because he was the prophet, after all, for God. He knew better when it came to infanticide, so why did he not know better when it came to this custom of marrying children? This raises the question of whether or not Muhammad really was a prophet of God. So I think that's all. Peace and love. Hope I didn't offend anyone too much, and take it easy.